Hey, what up? It's February 24th, 2024, and I just wanted to pop on here and give you guys a little economic update, man. Because, there seems to be all these people who think that the Fed is in control of, like, where things are going. And, I'm not just talking about, like, conventional mainstream people. I'm also talking about a lot of, like, gold owners and a lot of like libertarians. Uh, See, when you look at these assets, people are thinking, oh, well, if the Fed cuts, that's going to be good for everything. And I mean, mainstream people are like, oh, that'll be good for bonds because they'll buy all the bonds from us so we can sell to the Fed. It'll be good for stocks. It'll juice the markets. It'll be good for, the libertarians, like, well, it'll be good for gold. Um, and then they're like, but if the Fed doesn't cut, now you just want to have cash, right? Because now everything will collapse. They're like, well, stocks, bonds will collapse. And then people are like, well, gold won't do well either because fucking everything's going to collapse because it'll be like a deflationary collapse, right? Um, but you're wrong. Because what's going to happen, we have a fucking bubble that's going to collapse. And this bubble is in the US dollar and it's in US debt. So I guess you could call it two bubbles. Both of these things are going to collapse, but they're kind of related because the reason there's a bubble in the US dollar is because there's a bubble in the US bond market because people abroad have to get dollars to buy the bonds, and so that creates a demand for dollars. But these bubbles are collapsing. So both these bubbles are collapsing. And they're both collapsing regardless of what the Fed does. Now, the Fed might change the exact path to get to the destination we're getting to, but it's not going to change the destination. Both the dollar and the bond market are going to collapse. So let me break it down for you in a second. All right. So the Fed, let's say they change course, they, uh, you know, unleash the printing presses, they lower interest rates, they do the things that people are thinking are going to be good for all these asset classes: bonds, stocks, gold. Well, bonds, you're wrong because the 10-year, the 30-year treasury, um, the inflation risk is a real risk in these markets, man. If you're locked into a fixed payment for 30 years, you care a lot about inflation, man. And everyone agrees that if the Fed, that's going to be fucking bad for the dollar, right? Like everyone agrees that's going to be inflationary if the Fed lowers rates. I mean, that's everyone can agree on that. So, um, that is going to be bad for those long-term bonds, and the Fed's going to be the only buyer. So the only way they keep that market is if they just buy up the entire market, but then the bonds are fucking worthless, um, because the dollar is worthless. It doesn't do you any good to have a bond that's going to pay you all these fixed payments if the stuff it's paying you is worthless. So the bond market still becomes worthless. Uh, so the Fed can't save the bond market. That's the point. Um, they don't get to choose, does the bond market collapse or does the dollar collapse? Both of these things collapse, and it doesn't matter what they do. Um, so the dollar, people think, oh, if they tighten, if they let everything collapse, well, surely that'll be good for the dollar, right? Like that's how you save the dollar, right? You create a deflation, that should be good for the dollar, right? But so you got to understand that the Fed has already created trillions and trillions of fucking dollars that all exist now. And so if the bond market collapses and the Fed has trillions of bonds, that portfolio becomes worthless. Well, now all the money they used to print that portfolio, that's still in the system. They haven't pulled any of those dollars out of the fucking system. All the dollars are still in the system. But what else is in the system? A real economy, things that have real value. See, that's all that's left. Because everything that had value that was based on future earnings, based on future payments in dollars. Okay, future earnings is different. If you can get earnings in gold, that still has value. But like future payments in dollars no longer have value. So any company that had was relying on that for income, they're now bankrupt. All the banks are bust. All the insurance companies are bust. Most of the U.S. economy is bust because most of the U.S. economy only exists because the government and the Fed have allowed it, have created it. Only things that have real value are going to remain because that's what the bubble is, right? The bubble collapses, what remains? Things that have actual real value. Things like gold, right? And other commodities. Copper, silver, land has value. Now, it would have a lot more value if the government let you do more things on your land that they don't let you do, but it still has some value. Your well, things, physical objects, machinery has value. Not every company, not every stock is going to become worthless because some companies own things that have real value. Some companies own plant, property, equipment. They have productive processes that allow them to take an input and create something that people demand. So some companies will still have value, but a lot of companies will need to be reorganized. There will need to be restructuring. A lot of equipment, because a lot of equipment that companies were using, well, demands are going to shift because now only people who have real purchasing power are going to be able to demand things that people are willing to produce. And so demands are going to shift, and not everyone who was serving a demand in the old economy is going to need the equipment they had to serve that demand. So a lot of equipment's going to need to be sold. A lot of land's going to need to be sold. A lot of commodities, there's going to need to be exchange. We need freedom, dude. When this happens, we need fucking economic freedom, and we need it fucking immediately. Because you can't start productive processes in America for the most part because we have tax law, we have regulations, labor laws, all these things that make it an uncompetitive environment on a global scale. And we have a global economy, so we need to be globally competitive, which means we need to have fewer regulations than any other country, and we need to have freedom. So that's what I've been advocating for, and I don't know how close we are to, this collapse. I don't know, by doing nothing, the Fed is not, tipping this balanced thing off the ledge, but it's gonna fall off the ledge eventually. Because the ledge is there's less ledge, and it's getting closer to wobbling and just collapsing, and that's where we need fucking freedom, man. So that's what I've been advocating for. That's what my book was about. If you happen to read it, which I produced a couple years ago, and so none of this is new, but I thought I'd pop on here and rehash it since I haven't talked about it in a while, and since it's a Saturday afternoon, and I got a few minutes while I'm having my smoke. So you guys, you have a good one.